Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's event, Private Violence, a book conversation about gender-based violence and asylum in the United States. My name is Andres Mejia Foxa. I'm the Associate Dean for Research, Policy, and Practice at the Keough School, and I'm privileged to welcome our two speakers and co-authors of the book, Michele Waslin and Carol Cleaveland. Michelle's a brilliant colleague and a good friend from our graduate student days. Back in those days, we shared the belief that our graduate student training will help us shape and influence policy debates one day. And fast forward in time, we are now in a privileged position where this is precisely one of the missions of the Keough School and its member institutes, to translate cutting-edge research to inform current debates with policy-relevant recommendations. Welcome. Michele is the Assistant Director of the Immigration History Research Center. She has written extensively on immigration policy and has authored multiple book chapters and publications that appeared in English and Spanish language media. Michele has had more than 20 years experience in policy analysis and advocacy around migration, working in different roles at the Institute for Immigration Research at George Mason University, the American Immigration Council, the Pew Charitable Trust, and the formerly known National Council of La Raza, currently Unidos US. Michele has a PhD in Government and International Studies from the University of Notre Dame. Carol Cleaveland is an Associate Professor of Social Work at George Mason University. She has also been researching patterns of Latino immigration since 2004, looking at police harassment and anti-immigrant ordinances affecting Mexican day laborers, and later looking at immigration-related trauma, including human smuggling of Latinas from Central America. She also provides pro bono for Central American immigrants for USCIS court hearings in the Baltimore, Washington, D.C. area. This conversation will be moderated by Kat Gargano, a Kellogg doctoral student affiliate and Peace Studies in Psychology. This event takes place in the context of the Kellogg's Graduate Student Appreciation Week, and I want to thank the support for the Kellogg Institute and the Klau Institute for Civil and Human Rights for making this event possible. For our graduate students, I've been told there are goodie bags in the bag that you can take with you. And for our audience online, you have a button where you can press if you have a question to ask, or you can type your questions in the chat box. Carol, Michele, thank you very much, and please take a quick look.
Well, thank you for the introductions. I think it'd be really great to start off with hearing a little bit more about, from your perspective, how this book came together and kind of how you ended up on this journey.
Well, starting in about 2017, if my memory is correct, I was asked by several immigration attorneys in the Baltimore, Washington area to do pro bono psychosocial assessments for Latina immigrants who were seeking asylum to take with them to immigration court. The women I interviewed needed these evidentiary packages because they had been arrested after crossing the southern border. They were in what are known as defensive asylum proceedings, which means they're literally defending their right to stay in the United States and petitioning to become asylees. So my role, I have 20 years clinical practice experience, and I was asked to do assessments to ascertain their credibility for court, which is a key part of winning an asylum hearing. Are the women being truthful in telling the stories that they're recounting? And then B, what do their psychometrics say about suffering PTSD or depression symptoms? So I started doing these assessments with some regularity. It was considered, attorneys liked the fact that I was willing to do them for free because psychologists in the area charge about $3,000 for similar assessments. So in the process of doing this, I was hearing these really unbelievably terrible stories from women from El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and Mexico about what had happened to them that had forced them to come here to seek asylum. They described gang rapes by gang members. They describe horrific gender-based violence, extortion, threats at gunpoint, threats to have their children kidnapped, having to pack up everything they own in a plastic bag and flee overnight and head north to cross the border, at which point they were arrested and placed in immigration detention. So then I started observing what happened in their court hearings. And those were very compelling moments because I saw how difficult a journey it is to convince an immigration judge that you meet all of the criteria to win asylum in the United States. And it became intrigued because asylum is set up, and Michele can speak more to this, but as a system for survivors of state violence to win protection. And these women had suffered what the former attorney general under Donald Trump called private violence. So as I started to formulate this book, I then went to my good friend Michele, who was at the Institute for Immigration Research at George Mason at the time. I wanted to work with another social scientist who knew about the landscape of immigration court and the extant policies informing it, as well as just being a really good social scientist to augment what I know about the personal histories and the trauma that these women had suffered.
Yeah, and I'll just add, so when I graduated from Notre Dame with this PhD in political science, I immediately went into policy in Washington, D.C., and I worked there for more than 20 years. And I always tried to keep a foot in the policy world and in the academic space. And I knew that it was important for me to do both and to try to bridge this gap between academics and policy. I knew that I was literally in the room where it happens in DC for many years, and that it was important for me to document that and to write that down. I knew that I was privy to a lot of information and decision-making that academics would want to know about, but I also knew that a lot of amazing research was being done that advocates and policymakers needed to have in order to make decisions. So in addition to my policy work, I would attend academic conferences, I would continue to write, to publish. And then when I made the move to a more academic job at George Mason University and met Carol, and she presented me with this opportunity to write this book, it was just a dream come true. It was this real opportunity to combine both of my worlds into this one book. And I'm just really proud of the work that we did on it.
Well, I think something that was really interesting about this book was the method. So you have this really big question, right, about why is it so hard for women who are fleeing some sort of gender-based violence, some private violence, to seek asylum? So can you tell us a little bit more about how you tackled that question? Who were you interviewing? Where was it taking place?
Yeah, I'll start us off. I interviewed 46 women who were seeking asylum in this country, and they came for either what we would call domestic violence in this country or gang violence. And sometimes they merged. A woman would become involved with a man only to find out he was a gang member, and that led for horrific problems. So what I did was I finally was, facing how do I access people? And so an immigration attorney in Washington who was pretty prominent asked me, Carol, would you be willing to do psychosocial assessments in exchange for getting to interview women? And I said, certainly. And so I had to go through the institutional review board at my university and get permission to sort of have a dual role, which they granted me. And then this immigration attorney sent out information about my willingness to do this on a listserv that went out to all the immigration attorneys in the Baltimore, Washington area. And I was inundated with responses. So over the period of 4 years, I interviewed 46 women who were needing gender-based asylum, who were making gender-based asylum claims. And what I did was I would interview them about their childhood. I'd interview them about their work history. I would have to sometimes ask them to recount their trauma stories. I always ask attorneys, have you already done an interview with this lady? Because I don't want to ask someone to tell me their trauma story twice. And I was always deeply relieved when they said she's already given the history. You can just fill in the blanks and maybe follow up with her about a certain point. But there was one attorney who said, no, you're going to interview her because she's going to have to recount this in a much more tense situation, and that's a courtroom. Because there were some cases where women had to tell the whole story on the stand. There were some cases where the judges let the written documentation stand. So that always varied. But so I interviewed the 46 women. I was also given, I think 20 redacted legal decisions made by immigration court judges in the Baltimore, Washington area. So I analyzed those. I'm a qualitative researcher by trade. And then Michele and I also both engaged in observation of immigrant court, asylum court hearings, which at the time were legal for us to enter. The asylum seeker has the right to say whether she's going to let you stay or not. All of the women I found were happy to have me there, have us there, because they felt like it was a source of support. So that's how we sort of triangulated the design. And I'll let Michele talk about her interviews. But so it was the 46 women, the 20 redacted legal decision, and between the two of us, observation of 36 asylum court hearings.
Yes, yeah, immigration court hearings are open to the public, but Carol had also made a good connection with somebody within the Executive Office of Immigration Review who was able to give us a heads up when there was going to be a gender-based asylum court hearing, so that we would go to court and we kind of knew that it was going to be a case we were interested in, rather than just showing up and not knowing what the case was going to be about. So that was quite unusual to have that kind of contact and that kind of insider information. It didn't always work out, but usually it did. I am not, I'm certain that we would not have that kind of information, that kind of contact today. So that was really helpful. And we observed court in the Baltimore and Arlington, Virginia. And then we also I interviewed immigration attorneys and former immigration judges. And we believed it was also really important to have their perspective on representing women, and also the gender perspective on hearing their cases, and what it was like being a judge and having to hear the women's stories and also work within this asylum system and make decisions based on immigration law and these women's stories. And then, yeah, we took all of that information and analyzed it and told the women's stories from these multiple perspectives.
So I'm curious to hear a little bit more about what that was like to have all of this rich data from all these different perspectives. I'm sure some of us in the room might be graduate students who might be facing some of those methodological decisions. So how did you go about that?
Yeah, it was a very large database. The interviews themselves with the women tended to be about 12 pages long, 46 of them that, we conducted the interviews, and I conducted the interviews in Spanish. I'm not a native born Spanish speaker. I'm not as proficient in Spanish as my colleague Michele is, but I could do it. What I did was I worked with Latina graduate research assistants that was really instrumental, because like the women I was interviewing, they were young, they were native born Spanish speakers. And so the women we met could relate to them. I led the interviews, and then I do read Spanish well enough that I coded the data set in Spanish. Then I had it translated by two Spanish speaking research assistants who verified accuracy. Then I coded it again in English. I used Atlas TI. You know, again, it was a big bulky data set, generated hundreds of codes, and then began to look for themes. And then once I identified the themes while we were writing the book, I went back and actually just printed out the interviews and then reread them again just to ensure the accuracy of the conclusions we were drawing.
Yeah, I'll say that Carol is a really good writer, and the way that she was able to really weave these stories together with the theory and the ideas that we had was really masterful. And then my job was to put the law and policy in there and to say, no, you can't use that word. That's not the right word. Or that's not how that works. And so, yeah, there was just a lot of back and forth. Co-authoring is hard. And then I moved to Minnesota in the middle of all of this. So there was just a lot of technology and emailing and phone calls. And and somehow we made it work.
And the pandemic happened,
Yeah,
which meant
that too.
some of the interviews had that normally would have been done in person, maybe in someone's home or apartment or a law office, ended up being done by Zoom.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask you, Michelle, as a Notre Dame alum, if there was a class or a program or anything specific that you felt was really helpful to prepare you to undertake this type of research.
Yeah, so many things. I mean, I had such a wonderful experience here at Notre Dame. It was definitely the right place for me. I studied human rights in Latin America. We talked about this yesterday. I studied human rights in Mexico and really enjoyed my experience here. I was really fortunate to take class with Professor Gil Loescher, who many of you know was a brilliant scholar who studied refugee issues, and he really paved the way for those of us who study refugee issues and working on refugee issues now. I took human rights courses in the LLM program in the law school as well, and I think that was really formational for my my work on immigration and refugee issues. I learned a lot from my colleagues, and I think they'll tell you that in graduate school, you learn more from your colleagues than you do from your professors sometimes. I spoke a lot of Spanish when I was in graduate school, and I think that's what helped me more than anything else, so thank you. And so I also, while I was here, I worked at the Center for Social Concerns, and I led service learning trips to Mexico, and I think that that was also really important for my experience here as well. So I think it was just a lot that kind of led me down this path and led me down the policy path and led me, to have the career, the kind of strange but wonderful career that I've had that in this book. So yeah, I would say that my Notre Dame experience was definitely a very important thing.
Well, now I'm wondering if each of you have a passage from the book that could really ground our discussion tonight. So for anybody who hasn't maybe had a chance to read the book yet, they can kind of get a sense of some parts that stand out to you both.
Start with the introduction, and the title is the title of our book is Private Violence: Latin American Women in the Struggle for Asylum. It came out a year ago via New York University Press. So Teresita was nervous. She sat outside an immigration courtroom on a dreary February day in 2020, her hands clasped in her lap. Next to her was her attorney, a balding older man in a black suit. Teresita was only 29 at the time she walked into court to make her case for asylum in the United States. She wore her dark hair up in a bun, a gold cross around her neck, serving as a spot of color with a somber court-appropriate outfit. Missing was her 7-year-old daughter, whom she had to leave behind as she fled for her life after her boyfriend pulled a gun on her, threatening to kill her. In Honduras, Teresita had been a university student studying dentistry. The domestic violence that eventually sent her to the United States to plead for asylum began when the man she thought loved her struck her in the head for returning from classes late. At the time she went to court, she worked in a bakery, a job typical for many women interviewed for this book. Teresita faced an immigration judge employed by the Executive Office of Immigration Review, which is part of the Department of Justice. An interpreter sat next to the judge wearing headphones and consuming copious amounts of caffeine, 2 bottles of dark iced tea. Once the hearing began, Teresita listened to the proceedings through headphones. What she heard at the beginning was an admonition from the judge that she would be subject for deportation for knowingly saying anything false. Then she listened as her counsel told the judge that he wanted his client to be considered for asylum as a member of the following particular social groups: women in Honduras who lack protection from the government, women in Honduras who can't protect themselves from abusive men, women in Honduras who are viewed as personal property. The judge asked Teresita if she minded having a researcher observer hearing. Asylum seekers have the right to exclude observers from the courtroom, but Teresita said the judge's presence would be a support during this difficult hearing. Also present was an attorney from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, whose job was to argue that Teresita should be denied asylum. So I can stop
Was there, so if we think about the asylum framework, for maybe anybody who's not familiar with how it works in the US, could you maybe give us a little bit, Michelle, of the history and kind of overview and why gender in particular isn't necessarily included in the protected groups we usually think of?
Yeah, I'll try to give you kind of the framework for the book and why it's called Private Violence. So the 1951 Refugee Convention defined a refugee as an individual with a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership in a particular social group, or political opinion. So gender is not included there. Women are not included there, right? This was written prior to the international recognition of women's rights as international human rights. So this is not surprising that gender or women were not mentioned here. Of course, men are also not mentioned here. Over time, the international community did come to acknowledge a framework that included women's rights as international human rights. And the UNHCR eventually did acknowledge that women had specific circumstances, right? That the violence that women suffer is different and should be acknowledged as different, and that the parties that signed on to the Refugee Convention should acknowledge that women are different, basically, and take that into account when deciding whether or not they're refugees or should be considered for asylum. And the US did, in fact, pass some guidelines acknowledging that, but they were not particularly strong or binding, right? So the US still has these asylum laws that were passed in 1980 that is based on that original definition of a refugee. But basically the United States, as other countries at the time, these were laws that were passed post-World War II that saw that people were going to be fleeing state-based violence, right? And they envisioned that these were typically going to be men that were going to be fleeing persecution by a government, right? They thought that people were going to be fleeing authoritarian regimes, communism, but more generally, we didn't think that we were going to be welcoming large numbers of refugees, period, right? That the US refugee system, I believe, was never intended to be really expansive. David Fitzgerald, who is a scholar from UCSD, explains this well. He notes that asylum does not exist to protect large numbers of people from the global south who need protection, but rather it seeks to sort a limited number of people who must risk their lives to arrive at a border and then run a legal gauntlet to prove that they are worthy of protection, right? So this was not a law that was written to protect women that are fleeing non-state violence in mind, right? And we know that people are fleeing for a lot of reasons, including women that are fleeing domestic violence, gang violence, and those women now who arrive at our southern border have to meet these asylum criteria that are really difficult to meet. They're really difficult for men to meet. They're really difficult for women who are fleeing this so-called private violence to meet. So really quickly, they have to prove that the violence they experienced rises to the level of persecution. And that's a really strict legal definition. Is it actually persecution? And often it's really difficult for women to prove that they've met that threshold. They have to prove that they are part of one of these protected grounds, right? That they were persecuted because of their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or member of a particular social group. And as you just heard Carol read, it's usually they fall into this group, particular social group. And the courts have gone over this many, many times. And again, there's a strict legal definition of what constitutes a particular social group. And it's often really hard for women to prove that they meet that definition. Then they have to prove that they were persecuted because they were a member of a particular social group. And that's often really, really hard to prove, right? Was she beaten by her husband because she's a member of a particular social group, or because her husband's just a really bad dude, right? And we have cases of the judge saying exactly that. Like, we believe your husband beat you, but we just think he's a really bad guy who likes to beat women. Then they have to prove that they cannot receive protection in their home country, right? So the judge will say, well, why don't you just move to another city? Why don't you just move to a gated community? Why can't you just go live with your sister? And often that's a really hard threshold to meet. And then the judge has to find this woman credible. And that might be really hard to do, especially because these women have suffered this tremendous trauma, right? And that affects their credibility in the eyes of the judge. Often these hearings are being held years after this trauma occurred because of the backlogs in our system. So if you get one little date wrong, one little detail wrong, the judge can say, oh, you're not credible because you got that date wrong. This is often done through an interpreter. So sometimes the interpreter gets the date wrong and the judge can hold that against the woman, right? And there are other cultural barriers that are also often causing a judge to say that the woman is not credible. So this report that came out a couple of years ago by the American Immigration Council had this quote that I think is really telling. It says, under domestic asylum law, immigration judges may simultaneously conclude that a person is likely to be killed if deported to their home country, and that the person nevertheless does not qualify for asylum because they will be killed for the wrong reason or by the wrong person. So you have to remember that these women are doing this in a strange country. She doesn't speak the language. Maybe she's able to hire a lawyer, maybe she's not. She has to try to collect all this evidence to make her case, which is really difficult. She's suffered this horrible trauma. She may be separated from her children. She's in a country where she's probably being treated like a criminal. She may be in detention, probably being discriminated against. People are being told, or she's being told she's illegal. She has no right to be here. All of this is compounded in, we call this compounded marginalization. And she's tried to make her case that she deserves to be here. She deserves asylum. And under these circumstances, that's really, really hard to do.
Yeah, thank you for kind of helping us understand how violence against women gets sort of relegated into this sort of other category. Carol, I'm wondering if you can talk to us a little bit about how this private violence is sort of a misnomer, right? That's kind of a misleading name because we know it's not happening in a vacuum. So could you tell us more about like the social and political circumstances and context around this?
Absolutely. One of the points that we made in really great detail throughout especially the first part of the book, was the social context that sent women who were suffering gang and domestic violence fleeing to the United States. And that was the fact that in all of these countries, there was a great deal of political destabilization. Guatemala had had a 35-year civil war with a genocide against the indigenous population. Once that war ended, which, by the way, we were culpable in funding the right-wing forces that waged the Guatemalan Civil War. We did the same thing in El Salvador for a 12-year civil war. Once these wars ended, what these countries had were large number of young men with no jobs, very little, if no access to education. A lot of the gang members had come from communities where there wasn't even potable water. So for men in these countries, if you're denied access to all of those things that let someone form a meaningful and purposeful identity, gangs can give men a sense of respect. They can give them income. They can give them a sense of belonging, a sense of community. So that's one factor. Another factor is that in many of the countries, the 4 countries we talked about, the infrastructure that we need to protect people is missing. There aren't laws. If there are laws on the books against beating and harming and raping women, they're often not enforced. The rates of prosecution, I believe I cited at one point in the book against male perpetrators who rape women in Guatemala, was about 3%. So that basically green lights rape, right? And so a lot of the women here described, the very pervasive violence, the fact that gangs control lots and lots of territory in Central America. One woman had to flee a gang by leaving with her clothes. Her mother walked out of it. There are sentries that stand at the entrances of these communities. And the sentries are there to guard against, we have MS-13 that occupies this one village, and then next door is Calle 18 occupies this village. So they have sentries to stand guard to keep watch over the populace. All of the women I interviewed described having to find ways to support themselves despite all of this violence. Like there was one woman who had a little store that she ran, and the gang said, you have to start paying us la renta, which is a euphemism meaning extortion money. And so they said, you're going to have to close your store. Well, she was smart. She said, well, look, if I close my store, I can't give you the money. And, I'm selling cell phone chargers here. They sell well. So she said, let me keep my store open. I'll give you the equivalent of $40 a week. So she did that, and that worked for a while. And then someone else encroached on the territory and it became a mess. But those were the kinds of, all of this is taking place. And in other words, there really is no such thing as private violence, right? All of this violence takes place because of public and state factors. It's either a lack of prosecution of people who are committing gender-based violence. There's the fact that our engagement in the drug war, our engagement in supporting a coup in Honduras, all of these factors have led to highly militarized societies where women often, we talked a lot in the book about symbolic violence using Pierre Bourdieu's work. All of the women learn to accommodate men in ways that they shouldn't have had to do. But so in other words, we argue that private violence is a false dichotomy. And I have a section of the book that could, if I may.
Yeah.
Do we have enough time? This is from an account in one of the courts, and this is a woman who had waited 5 years for her asylum court hearing. She was from El Salvador. And she had been, met a man. He turned out to be a gang member. He was finally in prison, not for what he did to her, but because he had raped and murdered a 12-year-old. When he was in prison, he sent the gang members to her store to demand conjugal visits and that she pay money to him while he was in prison so he could buy soap and all of that. So the judge is here deliberating whether to grant asylum, and and the man wanted her to have an abortion against her will, so he says that the judge said the political opinion of her opposition to having an abortion only implies in cases in which abortion is used by the state as a form of population control, and notes that this is an issue in China. He also questioned whether it was known that Leah, that's the woman, and Miguel had a relationship. Well, he treated her like his property or a prostitute, but they never lived together, the judge says. He said that he struggled during his deliberations to decide whether she qualified for protection as a Salvadoran woman. He said the reasons for that are from the excellent brief put together by this respondents' council. He notes that there's, quote, a machista culture in El Salvador. Did he persecute her because she's a woman, the judge asked? This looks like private violence for the most part. So he goes on. So I wrote, the judge characterized the violence Leah suffered in her home and at the store where she worked as private violence, a characterization that dismissed the realities of the political and social factors informing gender-based violence. She did win asylum finally because it came out that while she was doing these, quote, these compulsory conjugal visits, that the guards had actually watched through the windows, and so had the men in the prison. And because the guards who were agents of the state let these rapes happen, didn't intervene, that showed that the state was essentially complicit in violence. Had the guards not witnessed, he would not have granted her asylum.
So definitely we can start to see how it's not just private, but really connected to a lot of larger systems. I'm curious, as women are moving from, we've heard a little bit about their experience before and a little bit about their experience in the courtroom, but some of these kind of in-between experiences, of border enforcement and of detention. Can you tell us a little bit about the performative function of border enforcement that you describe in the book?
Would you like to take that one? Okay. Well, we talked a lot about and that Julia Stump coined this term, the crimmigration system. When women cross the border, they're arrested. Well, anyone who is meant to, but everyone who crosses the border is then arrested. They're apprehended. They're then placed for 3 days in what are called the hileras, which are freezing cold cells. Then they are charged with a civil offense of having crossed without authorization. They're then kept in immigration detention for about a month, usually, before they can be bonded out. All of this, because it involves arrest, it involves holding cells, it involves detention centers, it involves handcuffs and law enforcement. And then, the ICE post pictures of all of these people being arrested. It shows them as criminals, right? All of those images create a portrait of criminality, no matter their reasons for having crossed the border. So there isn't a nuance and an understanding of, under international and even still under American law, although it's certainly being ignored right now, people are supposed to have the right to cross a border and ask for asylum. The state that they cross into doesn't have to give it to them, but they're supposed to at least have their day in court and be able to make the case for why they would be in grave danger and suffer severe persecution if returned. But what happens is, because this has been wrapped up in immigration enforcement and all the rhetoric around our southern border, that they are now being seen as criminals. And that certainly colored the last, I'll go there, the last election. It certainly covered the Trump one in 2016. So there isn't this understanding that these are people who need to have their basic rights preserved. And so, we describe it in a chapter on immigration detention, this image of the southern border where the Border Patrol posted a picture of 1,400, brown-skinned immigrants being held behind a barbed wire fence, and it said this was the largest single group that's ever been caught, which sounds like criminal behavior, right? You catch criminals, you put criminals in prison cells. But what's happening at our southern border is we're putting people in prison cells who aren't criminals. They're just people who need protection.
Yeah, but we also found through researching this book and talking to attorneys that there was just a lot of inconsistencies at the time that we were writing this, that some of the women had been detained, some of them hadn't been, they had just been immediately released, while others had not. Some had received a credible fear interview, others had never received a credible fear interview. Some had been immediately put into asylum hearings, some had not. So even though there was the way the law is written, and then there are the ways that it was actually implemented. And in some ways it was actually kind of better than the way that the law had been written, and in other cases it was worse. So I think that that's also performative, right? Is that that there is certainly this element of appearing tough at the border, appearing tough on immigration, but that's also not always happening, that it's just kind of chance sometimes, and it's whatever resources they happen to have available, whatever people happen to be available at the moment. So I think that's also a part of this performative enforcement, performative toughness as well. And I think that happens today as well along the border, and some people here might know even better than I do right now. But there was just a lot of happenstance, a lot of inconsistencies we saw.
Yeah, and the women really described a lot of, there was a sense of uncertainty. They didn't know what was happening to them.
Absolutely.
And a lot of women said, I didn't even know I was supposed to ask for asylum. They just came across and said, why are you here? And they said, well, the gang threatened to kidnap my children if I didn't let them join MS-13. So here are my 2 little boys, and that's why I'm here.
Yeah, that's a consistent message, I think, that the American public hears, is that these people are frauds, that they are trying to game their way into the country, that they're trying to game the system, and that they've received very specific instructions for what to say and how to get into the country. But the women we spoke to knew nothing of the sort, that they were literally fleeing for their lives in the middle of the night. They had no information, and they got to the border and had nothing prepared at all. And then they were met with this very inconsistent response to them. And some were met with kindness, people who helped them, and some were met with utter brutality. Yeah.
And you already kind of touched a little bit on this, but why did women choose to seek safety here, and what are they kind of finding in our system? What is that lived experience like that you might have seen in the interviews?
Yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about the immigration court system and what these women experienced with the immigration court system. So I think we understand why they fled their home countries and they came to the United States seeking safety, protection. They wanted a better life. They wanted their children to be able to live without fear. They wanted them to be able to go to school, to prosper, right? And we don't have, I have to say, we don't have a legal immigration system that allows them to do that lawfully, right? They don't have a family member who can petition for them to come here lawfully. Even if they did, the backlogs would be decades for them to do so. They don't have an employer who could petition for them for a job. They don't have the education and the skills that would qualify for them for some kind of employment system, a visa. But even if they did, again, they're fleeing for their lives. Like the time frame doesn't allow for that. So unfortunately, they flee, and the only thing that might be able to get them legal status is their trauma, right? They're dependent on the worst experience of their lives to get them legal status in this country. And I think that in and of itself is not a well-functioning immigration system, that their only currency, their only chance of getting legal status is this horrific trauma, right? So having said that, they have to go into this immigration court system. So I think here in the United States, in grade school civics, we're taught about the court system, the judicial system, right? And that the courts are this separate branch of government, there's separation of powers, there's checks and balances. That is not the immigration court system. The immigration courts are within the Department of Justice. They are directly under the Attorney General of the United States. And so the Attorney General can discipline or fire the immigration judges as he pleases. The immigration courts are very subject to political influence, and we're absolutely seeing that right now. The Attorney General is firing immigration judges that are seen as too friendly to immigrants. More than 80 judges have been fired so far under this administration, and they are being replaced with judges who are seen as less friendly to immigrants, and even more problematic, they are being replaced with military judges. And they are going through cases very rapidly and just blanket denying asylum cases. That is what's happening right now in our immigration system. Court observers, which again, we were court observers. I volunteer with an organization called the Minnesota Advocates for Human Rights that has a large court observation volunteer project. We are being kicked out of immigration. They're not allowing observers, so they don't want us to know and to report on what's happening in immigration courts right now. Beyond that, the Attorney General can insert him or herself directly into immigration cases. It's called the referral power. They can refer a case to themselves, then they decide on the case, they rewrite the law and set precedent. And they have done this specifically in gender-based cases. So this is what Jeff Sessions did, what Bill Barr did, and now what Pam Bondi is doing. So they switch from chief prosecutor to judge. They decide the case, set the precedent that all the other immigration judges have to adhere to. So basically, they are now saying that domestic violence does not qualify you for asylum. They are saying that being a woman from El Salvador is not a particular social group. They're saying that if you are a victim of gang violence, you are not eligible for asylum, and writing that into the law, setting that precedent. So this is an entirely different species of very highly politicized court. And I think most Americans are very unaware of that when it comes to the immigration court system. So these women, again, they're entering the United States highly traumatized. They've gone through everything that Carol has explained thus far. They get to the United States and then they wait. They wait 5, 6 years for their hearing to finally come about. In the meantime, they're working, they're raising their families, they're trying to live their lives as best they can, and then but they're always fearing that day that they're going to have to go to court and to tell their story and to be re-traumatized. And then they get to court and they have to go through this process that is very antagonistic, adversarial, bureaucratic, lengthy, confusing, expensive, right? There's no right to a speedy trial. The rights that we have in criminal court are not the same that the rights that you have in immigration court. The rules of evidence are very different. There's no right to discovery, right? They have to try to get this evidence, like their medical records, for example, from their home country. Often it's their abusive spouse that might have that evidence. How are you going to get that? It's really, really difficult, right? Then they're in court. Most women, I would say, do not have an attorney. It's really hard to get a pro bono attorney. Attorneys can be really expensive, so it's really hard. The women we spoke to did have attorneys. That's how we found them. But we understand that that's quite rare.
About 30% for Latina, yeah.
And then again, this is all being done through an interpreter, which is really difficult. A lot of these women from Central America, Spanish isn't even their first language. So this is, really hard to be doing it through interpreters. Judges can be very cruel, very dismissive. For many of these immigration judges, their background isn't even in immigration law. They come to this not knowing the law very well. Judges belittle them and their experiences. They look down upon them because of how they're dressed, because they're poor, because of their education level, because they don't speak English. And we witnessed all of this, and we read this in these redacted decisions that we were given access to. So this has been really difficult. And scholars have labeled this legal violence, this whole process. And it's also been called the slow violence of immigration court. And it's called legal violence, slow violence, because it's generally socially acceptable that this is just what it is. These are acceptable policies and practices that seem routine, seem perfectly reasonable and acceptable, but they actually cause even more trauma and more injuries, but they're often accumulated slowly over time and they're invisible. And it just causes more uncertainty, more fear, more anxiety as the court date approaches and then during that court date. And this is what we witnessed during the court observation and then afterwards. And these are literally life and death decisions that these judges are making, right? That deportation, the Supreme Court found that deportation is not a punishment. But it is. Everybody understands that it is, and that it's a life or death decision to send somebody back to a country where they could face death. And women have the chance to appeal, but again, that could be very expensive. That can take years, and you most often are not going to win that appeal. Yes, are you going to make that effort to appeal something that is very uncertain and put yourself through more of that legal slow violence for many more years? It's really difficult. And during this time, many of the women we talked to were actually separated from their children. They had left them in their home country because that was the right decision for them at the time. But that's another form of family separation. And even, this was a surprise to me, that even when women won asylum, it can take another 5-10 years for your children to get a visa to come to the United States. And the attorneys told me how heartbreaking that was when their client finally won asylum, to then have to explain to their client that getting their children here was going to take many more years, because that's more legal violence, right? That's how our system works. That's the legal immigration system. And that was just heartbreaking. So, it's just not a well-functioning system. And today, under this administration, it's worse.
Yeah, I'd like to add something on that with the collection of evidence. It's very hard for people who've come to this country and they've gone to, say, a hospital in Guatemala after being sexually assaulted to get their evidence. I did an interview with one woman who she slid across to me a picture from an ultrasound. And of course, I'm not a medical, I don't know what I'm looking at. I said, what is this? And she said, well, I had to get an ultrasound here to show that my uterus is gone, because I had to have, and I can let you guess why she had to have a hysterectomy back home in Guatemala. But when she went to, her lawyer tried to get her medical records in Guatemala, they had disappeared. Now, it's weird that someone's medical records just vanish, but that happens. It's not like it is here in the United States. And so she had to come here and spend the money to have an ultrasound so she could make the case for this is what had happened to her as a result of an assault by, man's name.
Yeah, and we're going to touch on some of this, so building on what Michele was saying about some of the legal violence. Could you tell us, Carol, a little bit more about the concept of compounded marginalization and what some of the other kind of symbolic and structural violence involved in that is?
Sure. When we were writing this near the end, we started to put together, I relied on a lot of extant sociological theory to frame our analysis. You have to have a theoretical base when you're writing a book, or it's not going to work unless you're developing your own theory. And I used the same work that Cecilia Menjivar used in her study of Guatemalan women, looking at symbolic and structural violence. And what we came up with in our analysis, we started to look at there's the marginalization that happens to women as a result of the conditions in the sending countries that they had to leave, the fact that women were not protected, that they couldn't rely on their states to protect them from violence by gang members or by individual men. Then they had to cross the border where they were incarcerated, held for a period of time. Some of the women ended up like with ankle bracelets on. One woman described how embarrassing it was to be in the grocery store when it started beeping. So they were ascribed this kind of quasi-criminal status. Then they have to proceed through the very tortuous asylum court hearings that Michele did a very nice job describing. And so we call this social space a state of compounded marginalization that they lived in. They were allowed while they were here after being bonded out of immigration detention to apply for, and it took a while to get but a work permit, and that's about $450. They have to renew it every couple of years while they wait. They have to go out and they have to find attorneys. That's not easy. The attorneys charge from $10,000 to $12,000 for an asylum court hearing. That's tough on someone, and at the same time, they're working like cleaning the Target overnight, So that was what we used to sort of conceptualize the social space that they inhabited.
And following up on that really quick, I'm curious about, this is a unique project that you're talking to legal professionals, you're talking to people directly. What did you learn from doing this work about how we, as researchers or policy experts or psychologists or social workers could communicate with legal experts about some of these findings or about things that might be really important to frame an asylum decision or case?
It's a tough one. I don't know how to frame it for legal experts. What I can say is that I wish that more just the general public understood these issues better. Because right now, we're having vigorous debates over border enforcement, and every election now is built on what do we do about immigration. And Trump won a lot of political capital with all that he said he was going to do to get the, quote, violent criminals out of this country. And the asylum system that is so much a part of this whole issue isn't even in the framework of public opinion. When was the last time you heard a lawmaker from either side of the aisle talk about asylum? That needs to be in the public dialogue. That needs to be part of the public debate.
Can I talk a little bit about my conversations with lawyers and judges? Because like I explained, we thought that was a really important element to add to this. And I learned a lot from those conversations because the lawyers, spoke to women over the course of many years and really built relationships with these women, with their clients, and heard their stories over and over again, but also got to know them as people and got to know their families. And so what I learned, obviously they became very much affected by these women and really internalized a lot of this trauma. And they worked with many clients at the same time, right? So they heard a lot of this, and many of them experienced secondhand trauma. And I asked them, how does that affect your daily life and how do you cope with that? And I just heard a lot of stories from people, and some of them are my good friends who I worked with as well, about how they would cope with it. One friend told me the story about how she was at an airport. She was just she was just traveling somewhere for fun, and she, accidentally got in the wrong line, and she saw that the flight was going to Guatemala, and she freaked out. There was no way she was going to Guatemala. And it just, she had a really traumatic breakdown at the airport when she saw that that's where this destination of this flight was going, just because she had heard so many stories about violence in Guatemala. And it just really, really affected her. Other people, told me a lot of similar stories about just having really intense reactions to seeing movies, television shows, can't watch things on TV, can't see certain things. One attorney said to me, when it's a client, especially in the current system, you're talking about a relationship that endures years. You're spending hours and hours and hours with the person preparing their case. You read their horrendous psychological evaluation. We're deeply embedded in that person's life. I don't really do domestic violence cases anymore, and there's a reason. I don't want to do them anymore. I'm done. I can't. I just can't do it anymore. And I heard a lot of people tell me that, in fact. And it's kind of heartbreaking because right now I just feel the need is so great, but so many people have told me that they're just not taking these cases anymore, that after many years of practicing, they just can't do it anymore. People told me about their coping mechanisms. I met somebody who's an ultra marathon runner. She has to go to that extreme to get this out of her head. People told me that they just call their friends and cry a lot. There's a really close community among immigration attorneys that they really rely on each other. And then there's this quote, which is one of my favorites from the book that I want to share with you. She said, "The more difficult trauma to deal with, the kind of trauma that sometimes makes me want to stop practicing, is the injustice trauma, the constant losing, the constant need to convince a judge that a man rapes a woman because she's a woman. That is exhausting, and I haven't found a way to make that easier. If and when this career becomes too much for me, it will be the systemic trauma that does me in, not the violence." And this was during the Biden administration. So I can only imagine what this person's feeling today.
Yeah, and kind of building off of that, something I get asked a lot from undergraduates that I'm mentoring and other researchers is sort of how do you manage your own well-being when you're engaging in research that is about trauma and where it might feel hopeless some of the time.
This was a rough 4 years, especially the last two, where the frequency of the interviews increased. I did have periods of sleeplessness. I did have some panic attacks. I developed an anxiety disorder. It was awful. And luckily that's abated, but I internalized all this trauma. You can't escape it. You can't listen to all that suffering and not have it affect you. So I'm speaking very personally, and I don't usually do that. I'll be honest with you, what I did a lot was I tried to rely on talking to people. I relied on my faith, and eventually I did start to feel better. Mercifully now I've gotten a grant to help set up a public health program for Latino immigrants in Virginia. And it's given me a chance to go out and just do something really beneficial, which is organize vaccine clinics It has nothing to do with trauma. You know, you hear about it a little bit on the margins, but if I can just help people stay healthy, you know, in my last year of work, because I'm retiring in May, that's a major help. So that's been kind of a boost for me. So I am planning to still work with asylum seekers again after I retire. I want to do what's called accompaniment, where you go with asylum seekers to their appointments with ICE. I don't know how that plays out now in this environment, but I plan to do that through an organization in my community, and I'm looking forward to that. I hope that answered the question.
Thank you. And kind of touching on what you were talking about maybe accompaniment, what do we know from the research about how women are building kind of these meaningful lives while they're still in this limbo in our system?
The women were incredibly resilient. And the women who did win asylum described, I'm making $23 an hour. I'm pouring cement. It was amazing too. They got these jobs that you don't typically think of women getting, but they had gotten like good construction jobs, and they seemed very happy. But the women who lost asylum and were under appeals were fairly frightened. There was one woman from Mexico who lost her domestic violence claim. She's now appealing it to the Board of Immigration Appeals. But she described, friends of hers saying, you need to go underground, you need to hide, you need to move out of state. And she said, I'm not going to do that because I haven't done anything wrong. Mm-hmm. I'm just in the United States trying to stay safe. And I have my children here. I now have my grandchildren here. And I just want to, work and continue with my life.
Yeah. These are really tough cookies. They survived a lot in their home country, and they made that tough decision to leave, and they made the journey here, and they're survivors. They're so much stronger than I am. We can learn on.
And then I'll just ask if you would want to read one or both of those passages. So the first one on page 150 is about kind of ICE showing up at the door. And I would be curious to hear a little bit about what we can understand, like how this can help us understand about how our system is designed. So I don't know, Michelle, if you would.
Yeah, so this was a passage about a woman we named Inés, and she had gone to court with her two sons, and she had her initial hearing, and then the judge talked to her and dismissed her and told her that she would come back for her next hearing. So she left with her sons, not understanding that the judge was planning to call her sons next, but they had already left. So Inés thought that she had done as instructed, but she hadn't. The judge expected her sons to appear before him separately, but Inés had not realized that. Inés's lawyer later explained that the judge thought that they hadn't been in court, and he ordered them removed. Her next appointment was an ICE check-in, which is routine for asylum seekers. There, an ICE officer informed her that both sons were under removal orders because they failed to appear in court. Inés explained, the official of immigration told me that, supposedly, that my children had deportation. I told him, but since I went to court and I said, the judge, there are cameras there. He can see that I entered with my two children to court. There I went in front of him. I told him. I even signed a book. My son signed, and I signed for my younger son. I also told him my son's names. I said how we had been present. Referring to an official document, the ICE agent told her again that both of her sons were under removal orders for failing to appear in court. The next day at night, we were in the apartment where we lived, and the immigration officers came. In the evening, about 8 o'clock at night, and they rang the doorbell of the house. They were looking to supposedly to detain the boys. So here there was a misunderstanding, probably a language barrier as well, and her sons were removed by ICE, even though they had actually been in the courtroom. And I wish I could say that this was rare, but this is the kind of thing that happens all the time. Immigration law is incredibly complex, even for educated people who speak English. It can be really tricky, and people make mistakes all the time. And sometimes those mistakes are overlooked, but sometimes they are not. It's kind of a crapshoot. But this is part of that legal violence of the immigration system. But unfortunately, like right now, we have an administration that will look for those little inconsistencies and use any excuse, right, to try to catch somebody up. So things like in an application, if you leave a space blank instead of writing NA, they can say that that's a violation and can take you away for that, right? Like they'll use any kind of excuse. And, you know, if you don't show up for court, they'll order you removed in absentia. And you may not have even known that you have a court date because they may have sent it to the wrong address, or it might just have never arrived, right? Like these kinds of things happen all the time, and they're happening more today, right? And I just want to go from that point to just kind of talk a little bit more broadly, because we were talking about this earlier. Like we wrote this book a couple of years ago. It came out exactly a year ago. And then a couple days later was the election of 2024. And so much has changed in such a short period of time. And we tried to write this book being very hopeful and putting in recommendations and ideas for what Congress can do to try to make some technical changes to the law to open the door more for gender-based asylum cases, what Congress could do to kind of fix the asylum laws, right? What the administration could do. And unfortunately, it seems so quaint now, those little ideas that we had for fixing the system, because so much has changed, right? In the first Trump administration, they made it very clear that they had no interest in asylum generally, and very specifically gender-based cases. They completely shut the door on gender-based cases and made it clear that private violence was not a criteria for asylum. Then during this campaign, Project 2025 included very specifically that there would be no private violence, right? That would not be criteria for asylum. And they have certainly done that. And the administration has taken additional steps toward that, right? They have set precedent now using that referral power and beyond, stating that women do not constitute a particular social group. They've reaffirmed that private violence is not grounds for protection. I wrote this down because I wanted to get this all right. But it's gotten even more extreme, and the impact has gone well beyond these foreign-born women, right? We have a president who has been accused of sexual misconduct by more than 24 women. He was accused of rape by his first wife. He lost a sizable judgment for sexual abuse. We had a vice presidential candidate, J.D. Vance, who made comments suggesting that women should remain in violent marriages for the sake of their children. Just recently, the president made very concerning statements about domestic violence, and he thinks it shouldn't be a crime, right? He said if a man has a little fight with his wife, they say that was a crime. Basically, he is saying that this should be a private matter between a man and his wife here in the United States, that law enforcement should not interfere, right? The administration here in the United States has reduced resources that is available for victims of domestic violence here in the United States. They're cutting federal grants for domestic violence nonprofits. They froze funds for domestic violence charities that are serving trans women. They want to condition funding on charities' willingness to turn over abused women who they suspect of being undocumented to ICE. Some extremists are saying that all our problems started with the 19th Amendment and we should get rid of women's right to vote. The Department of State has removed references to gender-based human rights abuses from their human rights reports on other countries. There is an erasure of a separate section on women's rights and anything having to do with diversity, equity, inclusion, sexual violence, and violence against minorities and LGBT. All of that has been removed from the State Department's human rights reports. So I am very concerned, obviously, about what is happening to asylum seekers, not just women, but men. Nobody is getting asylum under this administration. I'm worried about women who are being picked up by ICE, put in detention. We know that pregnant women are being forced to give birth in detention. They're being separated from their children. They're being denied health care. I'm very concerned about all of that, but I'm also concerned about what is happening to US-born American citizen women in this country under this administration. I think that they are starting with foreign-born women because that is an easier target, but I think that they're coming for all women, and I think that we need to be very concerned about this.
I don't want to end on a total no hope. No. Here's where I have some hope. We're at Notre Dame. I'll quote the Pope. The Pope has spoken out against the maltreatment of immigrants in this country. He said, if you're pro-life, you cannot brutalize immigrants. There are social movements. If you go on to something like mobilize.org, you can find nonviolent protest in your neighborhood. I think we're going to have, I think that people are seeing that cruelty is the point. It's not going over well with a lot of people. I think people were wanting to get rid of, quote, violent criminal immigrants. That's fine. But I think people are getting really upset seeing people working on someone's lawn being dragged away. And I think we can build on that. And I think we just need to talk to people. I think we need to get the vote out in the next election. I think join a sine wave in your neighborhood or on campus here if there is one. But just, we're going to have to just keep the faith and keep going until there is lightness. Luckily, we've survived dark periods in history before. But yeah, Michelle's right. This is an ugly time, but there are people speaking out for the good. So let's just keep doing that.
Well, I think that's a good note to kind of end on and open it up for questions. So thank you both for sharing on all that you do.
First of all, thank you so much for having your knowledge and your time with us. Congratulations on your book, on your important work. That of course bring insightful thoughts and hope for when this darkness. Hope so. I was very interested when you both were talking about gender-based violence and this idea of what does it mean, state violence, bringing the symbolic violence to the floor. And it made me remind of Rita Segato work on las nuevas formas de guerra en el cuerpo de las mujeres, the new forms of war in woman's body, and also the pedagogies of cruelty that is speaking in how in the role of state in maintaining the gender-based violence by its silence or the lack of work or agency in that thing. But also, and mainly the work of Julius Fouquet, who discussed the idea of low intensity war against women. And she basically compares the effects of torture and domestic violence to define what does it mean low intensity war in woman's body. And I wanted to hear more about this idea of state as the perpetrator of the violence and the other meanings of what does mean state violence from you. And also, I didn't present myself. I was so excited by I need to have question and hear for them because they are so amazing. But my name is Maria Eduarda or Duda. I'm from Brazil. I also worked and lived in Colombia, Argentina, I'm doing my master's degree in international peace studies, like global affairs, international peace studies, my major. And now I'm working as an intern in the Restorative Justice Collaborative Hub. And we are hearing like lots of stories, and like the top one stories and like harm is domestic violence or intimate partner violence. And many of the women, like as immigrants, do not want to report because they don't speak English, because they are afraid about like this crazy world, and they like going back to their home. It's not home anymore. Like they cannot return. So I wonder, like, how do you see the victim-centered advocacy, restorative justice programs? How like do you see them growing? How do you see like this work in this process of social transformation? That of course it's not just intimate, it's not just individual, like it's not just like, oh, the problem of this man, like this man is a monster. Of course, he's not just a monster, he's a like beautiful son of patriarchy. So like how do you see that? And like the other question really quick is that if you worked with
If I work with
Trans women as well.
Yeah, there were no trans women in our, who were referred to us. There were two lesbians in the data who I did interview. One of them did actually win asylum because she had been raped by police officers and could document that. So because she was raped and harmed by uniformed police officers, that was an easy case to make, that it actually had crossed over into state violence. But it was just a happenstance that we were not referred anyone who was trans.
Do you have a response to? Sounds like we could learn from you.
Yeah.
You're kind of making the point for us. I think that we're familiar with some of that literature, but I think that's exactly the point, right? Is that private violence is such a misnomer, because this is not private. This is not just a matter between a husband and a woman, right? That there is a state role in this, either that the state has a direct role, or the state has a role by ignoring this, by failing to provide protection to these women. We have so many stories where women went to the police to report the crime, and the police literally laughed at them and told them to go back home, that there's nothing that they can do about that. Or the police did, file a protection order, but it did absolutely no good at all. Or the police were working, with the gangs. They were taking bribes from the gangs. So
They were
working
terrified
together.
of.
Or the police were scared of the gangs. So they offered zero protection at all. So it was absolutely a failure of the state to protect their own citizens. And we had a long list of laws in the countries that were meant to protect women, but those laws were not being effectively implemented. But the judges would sometimes refer to those laws and say, well, you have good law on the books, so, the state protects you, but the state was not protecting them. So no, I mean, that's our point, that this is absolutely not private violence, that there is a law of state protection or a state role in this. But the US's laws have not evolved to acknowledge that. And, again, as I said at the beginning, I think that is, at least in part, on purpose. Our laws are not meant to welcome large numbers of people. Our laws were not meant to provide protection to large numbers of people fleeing with themselves. They're supposed to be very narrowly interpreted.
What other questions do we have? I see.
Hi, my name is Agustina. I'm from Argentina. I'm also in the International Peace Studies graduate program. I used to work in resettlement, and I worked a lot of cases very similar to this, including to the US RAP program. So obviously resettlement is a bit different because you first need to prove that the person has a need to be resettled. So there are a few categories like showing that the woman is a woman or girl at risk or a survivor of violence and torture, that while you are doing that research, you start to kind of gather the evidence that you will then use to prove that the person is in need of international protection. And this thing that you were just talking about, the police, is something that I use many times and so many times used to prove how if the police was being uncooperative in their home country, then that was something that would justify the need for international protection. So obviously, we didn't always hear back from USCIS regarding which cases that we submitted for resettlement were actually approved to come to the US. But in general, I'd say that most of the cases of women victims of gender-based violence, including trans women in Latin America that I work for, were approved asylum in the US and did enter the US under resettlement. Obviously, it was a different world. There were 125,000 places for resettlement. Now there are only 7,000. So that definitely is something to consider. But I don't know if you have an idea on why it is so different, the general outcome of resettlement petitions for exactly the same situation than people who are applying for asylum here under exactly the same law, just inside the country, and why the outcome is so different. And obviously based only on my experience, which it is completely limited.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I do not have an answer. It's just that the vetting process is very different, who does it and where it's done. But I'll also say that we don't know the answer because the United States does not keep statistics by gender. So we know how many people apply for asylum and how many people are granted asylum and from what country those people are, but we don't know how many are men and how many are women because they don't keep those statistics until very, very recently. And we also don't know why they're applying for asylum. So again, very recently they started keeping statistics by gender, but we don't know if a woman won asylum if it was a quote unquote gender-based case, right? So, and that's really unfortunate. And I don't know why they're not keeping, I can guess, but I don't know why they didn't keep those statistics, but we just don't know. So I literally cannot answer that question because we don't have the numbers.
Mm-hmm.
I guess another question over here, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for the very impressive book and also the research and the speech. My name is Juliet and I'm a student from sociology department. And I have some I really like the work and I still have some puzzle piece, I guess, I need to be answered. I'm most wondering, based on my knowledge of immigrant law, but correct me if I'm wrong. If you need to seek asylum in the United States, you need to be physically first to be here in the country. But I'm just wondering, when these women first came to the States, where did they settle? Do they have local connections, family or friends to help them to settle? And what kind of identity, are they considered as undocumented immigrants at that time point before they can find a lawyer to help them to seek asylum? And how will they navigate their life during that time period when that even before they can find a lawyer to seek for a legal identity in the country? And is there any local organization that is actively helping them to navigate their life after they have physically reached the country? And also a little bit building on that question, I'm generally wondering, because the asylum immigrant system is kind of it's known to be hard and it's kind of designed to be very hard for people to seek asylum. Why did they choose to came to the United States? Did they talk about that in the interview? Why didn't they consider other countries in the world?
Well, the United States geographically makes the most sense, right? You're in Guatemala or El Salvador or Mexico. What is the next place that's closest and safest? Is it the United States or is it Canada? So there's a train that a lot of migrants ride that goes up through Mexico that they call the bestia, which means the beast. But they sit on that until they get to the border, and then there are well-established human smuggling syndicates that they pay to try to help them cross the border. And we describe that in some detail in the book. So it's a very fraught process. It's not a good process. There were a lot of questions there. I think I lost track of all of them.
I think with your local support.
Yeah, there are organizations locally in most metropolitan areas that do help refugees and asylum seekers and immigrants. In Baltimore, where I live, there's an organization called Asylum Women's Enterprises that provides healthcare, legal assistance, food, clothes, all kinds of services like that. There's the Esperanza Center in Baltimore, which again helps with legal aid and with food. And a lot of universities law schools will have pro bono. They'll take a limited number of cases, but they will provide pro bono assistance.
Yeah, there are, a lot of immigrant communities in the United States. So even if they don't have a family member who's already here, they can generally find a community of people that can help provide them with a network that can help them settle here in the United States and find some work and find a place to live. So there are networks. Now, they're not given any money or assistance, right? So you need that network to help you navigate while you're here, because you do have work authorization, so you have to find a job, and then that network can kind of help you settle in, because it is going to take years for you to get your hearing, and in the meantime, you're going to be living here for a while. And again, some people have lawyers, some people do not, but they tend to find a network from their home country that can help them in the meantime. Yeah, and so they are technically undocumented. They do not have legal status, but they are known to the US government. They are asylum seekers. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a really good place for us to wrap up because I see we're out of time. So thank you all for coming.
Thank you.